Thank you, Claudia, for making the time to chat with me.
Of course.
I just want you to share briefly about yourself and your upbringing in the Bronx, in the South Bronx.
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I am Afro-Caribbean. I was born to I was born to first generation immigrants from the Dominican Republic. I'm second generation immigrant. I was born in the South Bronx. I was raised in the Northwest Bronx, which is interesting. So not too far away from here, Kingsbridge and Sedgwick. 192nd and University. So I was surrounded by Dominicans, Puerto Ricans, Jamaicans, working class people, poor people who struggled to survive, but people who were filled with joy, people who were filled with pride, people who, made sure they take care of their families and their children didn't necessarily know that we were poor because we had what we needed to be able to live. We had clothes on our backs, we had food on the table, and lived very humbly, but we're able to live. And so that's the community that raised me. I feel like being in the Bronx, living in the Bronx, coming from the Bronx, opened up my eyes to be able to go to any neighborhood across the country and across the world and connect with people who are poor and working class people all across the globe. I feel like there is something that connects people who are in struggle, people who are making the best that they can with whatever little they have, from the favelas in Brazil to the neighborhoods in South Africa to people in Puerto Rico and the caseríos. Like, we connect with each other because internationally we have our class, which is a class that is oppressed, is exploited by the wealthiest of the world. And we also survive very creatively. And so I think what I have been given by the Bronx community is precisely the resistance, the resilience, the ability to communicate with people across historical lines of division that have been made and imposed by the wealthiest, the whitest, and the most vicious people in our society. So I'm very proud to be a Bronx native. I'm very proud to be from the South Bronx. We're constantly told that the Bronx somehow is less than, that somehow is the most violent, that is the place that most people should avoid. And I completely go against that argument because there's a lot of good, working class, dignified people who make the best out of having been neglected and having been made invisible by capitalists, by the wealthiest, by these politicians that don't amount to anything. And so I'm very proud to be a Bronx native.
Yes, we're proud that you're from here también. You've been organizing for a very long time. I wanted to ask, what radicalized you? Like, what was the moment that you can recall that radicalized you to start organizing in the community and beyond it?
I mean, I have had many questions about the conditions of my people. I was born in the Bronx. I was sent to the Dominican Republic, as many people are often sent to the Dominican Republic to, learn more about the culture, but also to be educated over there. My parents wanted me to have a sense of identity, of where they came from. And they also felt it was safer for me to be in the Dominican Republic. And when I came back to public elementary school on Tremont in Grand Concourse, and I would go to school and actually jump over crack vessels in, the basketball courts where people used to take recess. Like, why? What are these things and why are they there? Are questions that pop up. Like, if you live in the Bronx and you experience police brutality, like the case of Amadou Diallo in 1992 when I was 11, you ask the question, why did they shoot him, right? And so I think that the very conditions that I experienced growing up in the Bronx that didn't necessarily, people didn't necessarily have an answer to except for that's normal and that's how things are, were not enough for me. So I just kept asking questions until my mom said, you need to find answers that I can't give you, so I'm gonna take you to this place. And she took me to a church that was a radical church, filled with a lot of socialists, filled with Puerto Ricans who had been in the struggle for the freedom of Puerto Rico, for decades. People who were organizing around the freedom of Puerto Rican political prisoners at that time in the 90s. People who are organizing the nietas and the Latin kings to understand the enemy is capitalism, not each other. So how do we organize against police brutality? So all of these things are happening in the 90s under Giuliani. And I meet this group of people who are supposed to be Christians, but they're socialists too, and they're just taking me out to organize as a 13-year-old. And so what radicalized me were the questions that I was asking based on the conditions I was experiencing, and being able to, I always say I've been very privileged to be exposed to politics in a very clear way from a very young age. I came into that community at 13, and they made sure I read and I studied. They made sure I understood, my Christianity, my faith in relationship to liberation. They made sure that I was exposed to struggles from the United States, from the Black liberation movement, the Move family in Philly, taking me to protests and demanding the freedom of Mumia Abu-Jamal, Leno Peltier, you name it. This church was involved in all of these different struggles, and I consider myself privileged enough to have learned about not only domestic struggles and that history, but also international struggles that are anti-imperialist struggles, and understand myself having much more in relationship to the global South and the struggles of historically marginalized communities in this country than with any, wealthy artist or politician. So I was very clear at the age of 13 that I wasn't them and that they wasn't me. And so I needed to be able to be part of something that was purposeful, that meant something, and that was transformative, not only for me, but for the very conditions that called into question my whole existence and my experience in the Bronx.
What made Claudia de la Cruz, una dominicana from the Bronx, from the South Bronx, run for president? What was...
That wasn't my dream. I mean, my dream, I don't... People often... People who don't know me, and people who don't know the trajectory and the community work and the organizing and the education work that I've done, they see the campaign and they're like, but you're a politician. And I honestly don't consider myself a politician in the construct of what we understand politicians to be. I'm not aiming or wanting to be that. I'm always going to be an educator. I'm always going to be an organizer, a mom. That's who I am in essence. But I think what attracted me about the possibility of doing the campaign was why we are doing it. We're doing it as a intervention in a historical moment to be able to move people to organize, to mobilize the communities, to actually talk about socialist solutions to the capitalist problems that, the wealthiest in the world have created for us, that we haven't had a choice on. These things have been imposed on us. And so I was asked by my party if I would do it. And as militants of a political party, and a political, I mean outside of the Democrats and the Republicans and some, parties that are not embedded in movement. The PSL is embedded in movement. It comes from movement, from organizing, from being in community. When we belong to those parties, especially, my experience with the PSL is that you have a task, you have a responsibility, and you're called on to complete a task or do a task because that's part of your responsibility as a member of the organization. And we have thousands of comrades all across the country, 92 cities, and everyone plays a role in building the party. And so at this particular moment, I was asked to do this, but I could be doing anything else at any other part or in time, I wasn't very happy or excited at the beginning, but again, understanding it within the larger context of building organization, of contributing to movement, of doing mass education, of sprinkling, if anything, at the very least, some sense of hope, amongst our people, and confidence amongst our people that we have the power, and we have always had the power to transform reality. That was it for me. If I could do that, then that's fine. Because ultimately we know that in the two-party system that we live, in the system in which, Wall Street banks are the ones that rule, working class people have very little chances in that democracy. We have very little chances to be able to get elected into the presidency. If we had a real democracy, if we had a popular democracy where actually it was one person, one vote, where we didn't have the electoral college, then we could say we could potentially advance a little bit on that end. And we've also experienced, the very intentional breakage of our organizations. Think about the 60s, 70s, all the infiltration and all the killing of our most precious leaders of that time, the imprisonment of a lot of them, Assad is in exile in Cuba. There was an intentional counterinsurgency, counter-revolutionary actions to be able to break us. And it's important for us to understand that only through political organization and the development of organizations that move our people, that build the confidence of our people, that teach us how to be human, divorced from the logic of capitalism, is that we're actually able to advance things. Electoral politics is a small piece of it. You could have all the elections you want, but if you don't build the people power, you'll never win.
Faltan 3 preguntitas más.
Okay.
Just explain briefly, what is socialism really, and why are people so afraid of it, especially in the Bronx, among our community, our older generation, they're afraid of the word, the S word.
I think we have to be clear, and that's why I often say that we have to treat our people lovingly, and that we have to approach conversations with our people from a very understanding perspective. Our people have been hit over the head constantly, intentionally, against the things that could potentially help them advance their interests. Everything and anything we've learned has been done to advance the interests of the capitalists, of the wealthiest, of the ruling class, of the billionaires. For example, we elect people in Congress who are not in our pay grade. People who are millionaires or people who are making, a ridiculous amount of money and are at the will of Wall Street corporations and other billionaires. They don't represent us, they represent the people that are paying for them to be there. And we are told that somehow that's the democracy that we need to live in, and we're expected to be okay with that, right? So our people have been hit and have been targeted so heavily to think about socialism as the enemy, when in fact capitalism is the one that has produced mass incarceration. Capitalism is the one that has advanced climate catastrophe. Capitalism is the one that has waged war all over the world and in our communities. I mean, you talk about drugs, and the war on drugs was nothing more but a way to be able to criminalize poor people, because we don't own ports. We're not the ones bringing in those drugs, And in fact, there has been documentation that the government, in so many ways, were part of bringing those drugs into this country. And so I feel and I think that it's important for us to educate ourselves about what it is that this ruling class in this country is so afraid of. They're teaching us to fear it, but why are they teaching us to fear it? Could it be that maybe socialism is the antidote to capitalism? Socialism is what will get us out of the problems that capitalism has created, and I think that is just it. You have a lot of people who are convinced, and I agree, that we don't need these racist cops. We really don't need them. They're there to protect property and to protect capitalism. But yet we have them in our communities, patrolling, surveilling, beating, brutalizing our people. Somehow we've been taught to normalize that these are the people that keep us safe, but we know deep inside that they don't ever keep us safe. In fact, they increase the possibilities of brutality in our community. So when we talk about socialism, we're talking about community safety. We're talking about having people get what they rightfully deserve, housing, education, healthcare, to have the organization of society to serve the majority of the people. Why is it that gated communities are not that surveilled? Why is it that gated communities don't have the number of police members that are patrolling all over the place and beating people up? Because they have everything they need. And so crimes of poverty become an issue when there's poverty. And so the only way of eliminating that is if you eliminate poverty. And capitalism is not concerned with the elimination of poverty because they benefit from it. And so I think we need to be able to educate ourselves and share that education lovingly with our people and raise the questions. Raise the critical questions that we are not taught to ask. Why is it that we live in a society that is a debt society? Who benefits from us being in debt? And who are the actual people that are in debt? Poor people. You don't get indebted unless you're poor. And so raise the questions, deep dipper, be in conversation with our people about the things that really matter. Everything else is a distraction.
Esta es la última.
Oh.
There wasn't two left. How can we in the Bronx, in New York, support your campaign leading up to November, but come November as well?
Okay. Well, the campaign falls into a larger strategy. Our campaign is not about electoral politics alone. Yes, we're trying to intervene in electoral politics in a way that allows us to defend the rights that we should have, that not everybody has, because voter suppression is a thing. There's a lot of people who can't access the vote because society is built in that way. So yes, it's about defending the voting rights. It's about expanding our democratic rights to access the ballot. But beyond that, it's about building a movement. It's about building an independent movement of working class people who are conscious and clear and have the willingness to transform society. So if the question is how do you support the campaign, is how do you support the movement? How do you become part of a political organization? How do you start an organization? If you're a student, how do you organize your campus? If you are a worker, how do you organize and unionize in your workplace? If you are and consider yourself to be and claim to be a socialist, why aren't you in a political party? So it's more about that. It's about building the ship before the storm, because we were caught October 7th with, the resistance of the Palestinian people and the counteroffensive to that. Strong Zionist narratives that dehumanize, that criminalize the Palestinian people, an ongoing genocide. And there's a very significant difference between the Palestinian movement and other movements, is that this movement is not co-optable. It's not as easily co-optable as other movements have been in the past. We're talking about genocide. And so there are more people unwilling to consent and go and vote for a genocidal candidate. So we have a moment to be able to say, I'm gonna vote with my values, I'm gonna vote with my principles, I'm gonna vote where my red line ends and where my actual principles and sense of self and dignity begin. And the third parties are giving that option. But beyond that is, where am I going to put my energies, the energies that have been on the streets, the energies that have been in social media, to be a stronger force in the collective form? What organization am I going to join? And that's the best way of contributing to the campaign, because that's ultimately the goal of it.